Have you ever been involved in a heated argument with somebody only to sort of discover at the back of your mind that their argument simply doesn't add up? Have you ever been swayed by a persuasive argument only to discover later on that their argument was full of inconsistencies and holes? Well, fear not, because today we are diving into the world of logical fallacies. I'm James. Welcome to my YouTube channel, where I talk about absolutely everything to do with research. Please like and subscribe. The first one that I want to talk about is the ad hominem attack. And you've all heard this kind of thing. It happens a lot in political debate. You can't trust that person's research because they're funded by a particular kind of lobby group or environmental group or some organization with a particular bias. Now, apart from the fact that you shouldn't take any funding from tobacco companies if you are researching lung cancer, let's just leave that to one side. But the fact that somebody is more prepared to attack the person than they are to discuss the issue at hand, that's called an ad hominem attack, attacking the person and not the issue. And there's a logical fallacy in all of that, because it doesn't make sense that you should be swayed in your ideas about a particular issue based upon the person who is making the argument. You should focus on the argument and not the person. And this is what's called an ad hominem attack. The next one is appeal to authority. This is where, instead of looking at a particular issue, we look at the person who is making a particular argument. They are an authority figure, and therefore the argument that they are making should be respected because they're an authority figure, and therefore that is how the argument should be decided. That is an appeal to authority logical fallacy. It goes along the lines of, if this particular person won a Nobel Prize in genetics, we should respect their opinion on vaccines or respect their opinion on some political issue. There is no reason for expecting that an authority figure is correct simply because they are an authority figure. Again, we should take a look at every issue on its own merits and not taking a look at the person who's making the argument. The next one is the straw man argument, which is where you misrepresent your opponent's argument in order to win against a weaker version of the argument or win against some sort of tangential point that's maybe not even quite closely related to that particular argument. And that's called a straw man argument. Some people say that we should reduce carbon emissions because it would help to fight climate change, but, and this is where you don't actually try to provide evidence about that particular issue. Instead, you would say something like, that would destroy the economy and cost jobs, etc., etc. So rather than actually dealing with the issue that's being made, we deal with another issue, one that maybe you can get more support for. And that's all part of maybe a broader group of arguments that are all called straw man arguments. You hear them quite often in political argument. The next is the false dilemma, or the false dichotomy, sometimes known. And this is where you present an argument that goes along the lines of, well, either we accept all of the claims made by my opponent, or we reject them all. In other words, that there are only two outcomes from this, either left or right, and there's no grey area, there's nothing in the middle. And presenting somebody with a false dilemma like this, forcing them to choose one or the other and not to take any alternatives, this is an error in logic, because quite often neither this nor that are completely the correct answers, and sometimes an answer that's somewhere in the middle might be a correct answer or a third answer entirely. But presenting somebody with a false dichotomy or a false dilemma is a logical error and a logical fallacy. The next I want to talk about is the slippery slope argument, and this is where you suggest that a small change today will lead to a bigger one tomorrow, that will lead to a bigger one, and all of these amount to negative consequences, and ultimately we'll end up having something that nobody ever really wants. So for instance, saying that if we allow genetically modified crops today, that will lead to genetically modified humans tomorrow, and the end of the natural world as we know it sometime down the line. So this is a logical fallacy as well. We should really stick to whatever particular issue is being debated right now and not projecting into the future, trying to think if there are going to be increasingly negative consequences, and often then being able to propose some absurd end point where if we allow this tiny change today, that something absurd will happen at some point in the future, and that's a negative that nobody wants. So we shouldn't do this thing today because it will lead to this down the line. It's called a slippery slope argument. It's an error in logic. We should focus on whatever issue is there today and decide on the merits of that issue or its demerits. Next, we have circular reasoning, where we use the conclusion of an argument as one of its premises. So for instance, if you've got a particular theory, you say this theory is correct because it is supported by evidence, and we know the evidence to be correct because it supports the theory. There's a circularity in that kind of reasoning, and again, it is a logical fallacy. It's false reasoning, and it's something that's very easily done, and you need to be very much aware of that you cannot use a premise to be a conclusion and a conclusion to be a premise. A hasty generalization is when you draw a conclusion based on insufficient amounts of data, or you've rushed to a conclusion far too quickly. So for instance, if you took a sample of 10 people on the street and said, do you prefer Pepsi or Coca-Cola? And 9 of those 10 people said, well, I prefer Pepsi. Then generalizing that to say that across the world 90% of people prefer Pepsi, that would be a hasty generalization. It's just a warning to us about the design of experiments or the design of research to say that you shouldn't reach a hasty conclusion based upon insufficient data or methods that are inadequate to answer the question that you are tasked with. Appeal to emotion is when we are trying to manipulate the listener into provoking an emotional reaction rather than a rational one. Appeals to emotion go along the lines of, will nobody think of the children? If we don't act now, our children will face an apocalyptic future, something like this. And this induces in somebody a response where they feel that they must make a particular decision, but that decision is loaded with emotion rather than based upon the facts, the evidence, and the issue that is at hand. False cause is when you have two events that happen together, and because they both happen together, we presume that there is a mechanistic connection between them, and the one causes the other. So for instance, a recent study showed that people who eat organic food live longer, therefore organic food is causing them to live longer. That's a situation where you have false cause, because unless you take into consideration the myriad other potential causes, then it may not be the case that simply eating organic food means that somebody lives longer. Finally, we have the red herring. Sometimes this is called whataboutery. So introducing some extraneous, perhaps irrelevant information in order to get a particular decision. Somebody might say, well, I know about all the dangers of nuclear fuel and nuclear power, but what about the dangers of coal, or what about the dangers of something else? And introducing these can be something of a red herring, again, a distraction. Rather than focus on the issue and trying to come to a rational decision based upon the issue in front of you, introducing extraneous, perhaps irrelevant information, we call that a red herring. I hope this video has been useful to you. It's just a small selection of all the potential errors in logic that you might come across. I'll make another video sometime in the future about more of these errors in logic. But for now, thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. And if you've got any comments, please leave them below. Thank you.